In Week 6 of Public Administration Institutions and Values, we'll review 4 theories of decision-making that are applicable to the public sector. We'll assess the strengths and limitations of each approach in terms of information and value considerations. And we'll take a closer look at examples of the rational and participative approaches. According to Herbert Simon, a theory of administration should be concerned with the processes of decision as well as with the processes of action. Simon believed that the task of deciding should be the central element of studying public administration. In other words, doing is impossible without deciding why or why not. Decision-making is the central element of public administration, as decisions are made at each step from the top to the bottom of an organization. There are 4 different theories or models of decision-making which are applicable to the public sector: the rational approach, the bargaining approach, the participative approach, and the public choice approach. Each takes a different view of the information decision makers use in reaching their judgments and how political values affect decisions. With respect to information, it of course is the foundation of decisions. Decision makers must acquire, weigh, and act on the data that they receive and collect. Information is often a matter of interpretation, and a challenge is to get useful information to the relevant decision makers without distortion or delay. Decision-making requires reconciling information and values. The interaction between public administrators and elected officials in information collection and provision is another example of the tension between neutral competence and political accountability. With respect to values, political values affect the context for decisions. These decisions depend on judgments that are made about the nature of the dilemma or problem, the probabilities of events, and the desirability of consequences. Recall the coverage of public values in Week 1 and the trade-offs between liberty, community, prosperity, and equality. Due to the complexity of public problems and the amount of information that's available, decision makers must simplify their context for decisions. And here's where values come into play. As Kettle underscores, decision-making is inherently subjective. Another challenge in making decisions, stick, is to get support from both the mass and the attentive publics, without allowing the relatively narrow interest of the latter to compromise the larger public interest. An example of the convergence of information and values is legislation that was debated during the 2012 session of the North Carolina General Assembly relative to sea level change. The State Coastal Resources Commission asked a panel of scientists to predict the amount of the sea rise. In 2010, the panel reported that North Carolina should be prepared for a 39-inch rise in the sea level by the year 2100. Concerned about the impact on coastal economic development, legislators and some interest groups favored a more conservative forecast, 8 inches, which was based on historic trends over the past 50 years and did not take into account the effects of global warming and some other factors. A legislative compromise was developed by a House-Senate conference committee that required the Commission to wait into 2016 before it could authorize any sea level forecast to be used in conjunction with coastal regulations. And scientists were required to consider a broad range of views, including predictions that the sea level would fall in developing new forecasts. So let's move on and take an in-depth look at the 4 decision-making approaches. The rational approach, which holds efficiency as the highest value and seeks the greatest return on the investment of public funds. The bargaining approach, which conducts limited analysis and emphasizes bargaining out a decision to attract political support. The participative approach, which seeks to improve decisions by involving those affected by them. And finally, the public choice approach, which attempts to substitute market-like forces for other incentives that could distort decisions.